access to intelligence is the single most important thing the next few decades. Like, your access to intelligence will be whether you can become 10 times, eventually 100 or 1,000 times more efficient, and is likely to lead in this next sort of explosion of growth in the industry. Is now all of a sudden we're taking all these superpowers, combining them, and doing something the big tech giants simply can't do. That's right. How do you connect a wallet with an AI? How does it represent me individually, right? As a personal AI. It's not owned by some government or some company, but rather, is working directly for me. For the same reasons that I want a personal phone or a personal computer, I want a personal AI.
David
Let's do it.
Johnston, thank you very much for joining me today. I'm really enthusiastic about talking to you because you are in the center of technology for the last many years, but in particular the development of blockchain and what that has led to the creation of a whole number of ways that we can decentralize what has become centralized. And that's what you spent a lot of time on. Then you moved to Web3, and then you have then you went to AI, and then you've kind of come back combining the two. And you're a terrific spokesperson for Morpheus. And all of this strikes me as similar to Mark Andreessen's Netscape that allowed for the access to the internet that had up until then really been limited to university and government people that could understand code and get on. And then as Netscape developed and more people came on the internet, it was Google that allowed for the organization of all the information on the internet, and that allowed it to scale. And we'll talk about the importance of 1 billion users, I'm sure. But I'd love to hear about how, the philosophy of all this, what's happened and where it can lead. The punchline is that Morpheus and other technologies are making it seem that we will have decentralized AI, which will eliminate this concentration of information and risk in the hands of centralized entities. So take it away.
Sure. Well, I appreciate the kind words. Yeah, it's been an amazing journey. I got involved in Bitcoin in 2012, wrote the paper on decentralized applications in October of 2013. So sort of set out this concept of everything that can be decentralized will be decentralized, right? And what's the framework for achieving that, right? Open source, peer-to-peer, built on a blockchain, has a token. I proposed effectively that was the formula, right? That was the way that Bitcoin succeeded. And if you wanted to build a system similar to Bitcoin, you really had to have all four of those components, right? And that was the core definition of what a DApp or a decentralized application was, right? To really use that term, it had to embrace that ethos and philosophy. And so, like you said, it's been amazing to see it go from, this small little niche of, when I got in, there was 10 million Bitcoins and they're worth $10 each, right? And so, now, go from that $100 million market cap to this being a multi-trillion-dollar industry.
This show is being brought to you by our sponsor, Truflation. Professional investors and economists, and probably any casual observers, know that government inflation statistics are only an approximation of what real inflation is. Not only that, but the government has a conflict of interest because high inflation can be so damaging to the economy, the deficit, and our $34 trillion in debt. Truflation collects over 13 million pricing data points. Most are updated daily to reveal inflation with precision for asset managers, governments, companies, and the general public. Check them out at truflation.com.
The last 12 years has been really incredible to see the industry go from that, little niche of, 10 million Bitcoins at $10 each, $100 million to, a multi-trillion-dollar industry. But it's really based on that same philosophy, right? How do we build independent, neutral protocols that anyone can use anywhere in the world, regardless of jurisdiction or, the government or rules that surround them, but really give them that self-sovereignty, right? To have their own wallet. And so when I first read the white paper for Morpheus, it really sort of inspired me because I've been thinking along similar lines of how do you create smart agents, right? How do you connect a wallet with an AI? How does it represent me individually, right? As a personal AI. It's not owned by some government or some company, but rather, is working directly for me. For the same reasons that I want a personal phone or a personal computer, I want a personal AI, right? The interactions that we're having with these AIs are just going to become more personal and more intimate over time. Really, it's an extension of the way you're thinking, right? You're asking questions almost internally and trying to learn something. This is not something you want to hand over to Microsoft or, the government or somebody else. And so I think, the technology that Web3 has built is really the solution for how you decentralize AI, extending this wallet infrastructure now used by 500 million people, right? And to use that as the basis for building personal AI, I think is the best solution.
I'd like to go back to the fundamental building blocks of how it all started, and what were the breakthroughs, and how did it
Mm.
build on itself to be able to get to this point?
Well, with Bitcoin, it gave us the separation of money and state, right? And you needed first just honest money that was programmable and predictable and not controlled by some third party, right? And so that's, the first email I wrote to my family about Bitcoin in 2012 is this is the first honest saving mechanism that has existed in our lifetime, right? Since, Nixon took us off the gold standard in 71, right? There hasn't been an honest form of money that I could tell you how many units are in existence or how many will be in existence in a future time. And so, we've really seen that play out, right? I'm fortunate there. I married a free market economics nerd, and she was, yeah, this is obvious. I mean, of course you don't want to hold dollars. They're inflationary and only lose value. Obviously, you should buy Bitcoin. It's like, God, I love you. Like this is why we got married, right? This is exactly what I was hoping for. Is it's great to have somebody that understands those fundamentals and can sort of apply them to real life.
Yeah,
And so that was life changing for us, right? Because first you needed honest money. You need programmable money. You needed distributed ledgers, and Bitcoin created all that, right? And really proved that you could separate money and state. And so to move into that next step, you needed the extension of that was the smart contract, right? I needed to be able to apply code and logic and scripted parameters, if this, then that, right? With no intermediaries, with no middlemen, just, directly be able to code. If this happens, then that happens, right? And Ethereum sort of really captured that energy in 2014 when Vitalik came out with his white paper in January 14 and said, hey, we want to do coding on the blockchain. We want to do scripts. We want to let people release these smart contracts. And so if you
Yeah,
look at
we
the
can we
initial white
can
paper, yeah,
we can encrypt more than just the ledger. Why don't we encrypt
yes,
computer programs?
all
That
the
was
instructions about how to use that ledger. And so, whereas the Bitcoin core developers really wanted to focus just on that, sort of digital gold use case, there was a separate, set of people that wanted to build programs on the blockchain, right? And they really found that home on Ethereum, and then it grew from there, right? Went from smart contracts to all of a sudden, doing a lot more, right? And being able to put all sorts of assets on the blockchain, became a reality very quickly. People started creating stable coins, right? I was one of the funders of Mastercoin, the first protocol built on Bitcoin initially, and then extended to Ethereum to create stable coins, right? And these real world assets on chain. And that was sort of opening this whole new set of use cases, right? Because, I may not be a fan of the dollar for the purposes of savings, but it has a very large network effect for payments. And so stablecoins have proven very popular for the payments use case. Even if after that payment, I want to go back into Ethereum or Bitcoin or something else, there's a very broad use case, especially for people in the developing world where dollar inflation is nothing compared to what they're used to in Argentina or Turkey or many of these jurisdictions would have experienced 25 to 70% annual inflation, right?
Yes.
And
I've
so
interviewed.
5% a year, yeah, they're not as worried about that. Just
Yeah.
accessing a digital dollar for them is a breakthrough, let alone having, a saving mechanism and all the rest. And so, that's sort of how this happened, right? From the money to the smart contracts to the real world assets, and AI had been bubbling in the background for a long time. For those that are familiar with the history, there's been 40 years, right? Longer than 40 years worth of work on AI, and always seemed like it was close to a breakthrough. But finally, right in 22 and 2023, we saw it hit that inflection point, right? And it went from sort of a novel tool to something very powerful that people could use in their everyday lives to write essays or to, do their homework or to help finish their work tasks. And so, as somebody that's always been interested and fascinated in the area of AI, it was great to see sort of that technology finally fulfill, the promises we'd hoped for back in, the 2010s. And so what I started seeing is the government started making all these noises about the need to control AI. And we really needed to be safe. And we really needed to, not, oh, we can't let this technology get in the hands of other people. And they started making these proposals that just sounded very draconian,
Well, they
right?
made a lot of sense if you looked at any of the sci-fi movies about it.
Yes, if you watched Terminator and had no basis in how the technology actually worked, yes, it made perfect sense. And so they sort of drummed up all this fear, especially last year, and it culminated in the executive order that Biden went out there. But what was the real world effect? It was regulatory capture, right? It was Microsoft and Google and OpenAI, you know, didn't really want all these pesky competitors, right? And they had their little club and their $100 billion club and up, you could get the license and the permit. But if you weren't in that club, you really needed KYC for the data centers and to restrict the models and to get permission to be able to do basic math, which is truly amazing. And so the community, this was not well received. Like, we held an event in San Francisco just after the executive order, and we said, we have to keep AI open, right? And in a single day of announcing the event, 700 people showed up that night to say, keep AI open. And that was sort of the floodgates were open. And people said, no, math should be legal. Language, human thought shouldn't be restricted, right? We need these systems to be open source, right? We don't want an outcome. The dangerous outcome is you have one company or one government that's in control of all future human intelligence, right? That's not a good outcome, right? And so, the momentum was building, and the Morpheus white paper had been dropped just a few weeks before the executive order by some anonymous developers calling themselves Morpheus, Trinity, and Neo. And so people were looking around for a solution and started pointing at that paper and saying, that's what we need, right? We need a personal AI that's all open source, that connects to the blockchain, be controlled by your wallet. Like, that checks the boxes, right? And the AI people, they hadn't really thought of these restrictions or expected them. They hadn't lived through the last 15 years like we had of, the state trying to destroy your industry and push you out and debank you and all these things, and the SEC lawsuits and everything else, and so they were coming from a very different context. I don't think they were expecting all these restrictions, but I think they've come to learn, oh, I can get cheaper compute. I can access it all over the world. The open source models are now just as good as the proprietary models. They've really come up that curve and reached the same standards as like a chat GPT-4. And so it's starting to make a lot of sense to the AI people that they need crypto. And to your point earlier, the crypto people need AI. They need a better interface for these smart contracts and for Web3 in general, right? We need that, moment of, the browser. We need that moment of the search engine, like we did in the early web, that made it accessible to billions of people. And I think people in Web3 realize that, right? And say, oh, wow, this is our opportunity to have a seamless interface that people just talk to the machine, tell it what they want to do, and it gets done, right? And they push one button and it's approved, right? So, on both sides, the momentum's just been incredible between events at, ETH Denver, just got back from Brussels, from the Ethereum Community Conference, all these decentralized AI days and summits have just been put together by the community saying, we have to build this, we have to build this now. And there's a lot of urgency.
I went to permissionless 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, something like that. And it was one person after another that was saying, when are we going to get the user interface to work? Because it was such an obvious block to adoption that you had to grapple with a hard cold storage wallet. And while it's not very complex, it's complex enough. And the same thing operating with MetaMask, and the same thing working through exchanges, where you had to accept a whole different level of risk that most people didn't understand. And so can you go explain a little bit about how that AI can break through that user interface, how that has the potential to do that?
So, and you can use this today, right? The nice thing is this is live right now. So if you go to mor.org, more.org, you can download a copy of Morpheus. You can connect it to your wallet and you can tell it to do something. I want to swap, some Ethereum for some WBTC. Great. It knows the contracts. It lines that transaction up. It asks you questions. Oh, how many do you want to trade? Like, is this the trading pair you're expecting? Here's the outcome. Do you approve? Right. And it's all in normal human language. You don't have to know the technical terms. You don't have to know the smart contracts. It understands what you're trying to
No
accomplish.
cutting
And
and
that's
pasting
the key.
addresses?
Yeah. That's the key is you want, you know, uh, all of those things to be automatic,
Yeah.
to be the default, right? That was the beauty of search engines back in the day, and they've gotten worse recently, but you used to be able to just ask it a question and it gave you the best options throughout the entire internet, and you clicked on the top one, you got a pretty good experience almost every time. And so that's the same user flow here. The user says what they want to do, normal human language. The AI gives them a proposal. Hey, here's how you can do that. If you want to approve, and ultimately the human still approves, is yes, click on this button in MetaMask, approve that transaction. And so what are you doing? You're removing all the complexity, all the need to know which smart contracts are trustworthy. Like that was half the value of a search engine is you didn't want to get scammed. You didn't want to go to some spammy website. And by curating for the best, right, you got a good experience and develop trust over time that there's going to be a good outcome, right? We need that same thing here. And so, what's the AI is doing in the back end, right, is it's pre-digested the best smart contracts. And how is best defined? Just like Google used to define it by number of links, you can look at a smart contract and say, oh, this one has $20 billion already secured into it, and it's been used 10 million times, right? You can see all of those metrics on chain. It gives you a very good indication of which are the reliable and trustworthy smart contracts and which one was published yesterday and has never been used, right?
Mhm.
And the user would have trouble seeing that from the outside, but the AI can see all that on chain, right? And so that's really the game changer is you're getting much better metrics without any complexity. And so, yeah, you can do that today, or you can go onto Venice.ai and you can use it to generate images or text, something that has nothing to do with Web3, but it's using the compute from Web3 in the back end, right? It's using the GPUs on Akash or Hyperbolic or a protocol like that in order to access Llama 3 or Stable Diffusion or whatever AI model you need to generate that image or create that text, right? And so that's the mass market. It's not just people that want to do a DeFi protocol. It's just somebody wants to create some images for their kids. Somebody wants to, write a story. Somebody wants to write an email. Like all those simple tasks, that's the top of the funnel, right? Is just give people a beautiful, simple experience all with open source. And I love Venice because you don't even need an account. You can just show up and use it. And all of a sudden, there's no friction, right? And if you love it, you can upgrade to Pro, you can connect your wallet, you can do all those things later, but you can start the experience with no friction, right? Long before Google had, Gmail and accounts, you could just show up to the website, type in what you wanted, and it gave you great results, right? You need to get back to that type of frictionless experience. And that's how we get to mass market for Web3.
And um, So this is a smart agent is that's what Morpheus is, isn't it? It's you've got a person who's acting a program that's acting as an agent, finding the best smart contracts to solve whatever the task at hand is.
Mhm.
Is that the right word for
So,
it?
so the best way I would explain Morpheus is it's a platform for smart agents, just like Ethereum is a platform for smart contracts. So Morpheus as a protocol isn't building any agents any more than the Ethereum Foundation codes up smart contracts, right? It gives people the tools, right? Ethereum gave people the EVM and Solidity and all the programming tools that they needed to deploy smart agents. And Morpheus is doing the same thing, right? What do smart agent builders need? They need compute, they need all the coding tools. They need a place to publish their agent. And the Morpheus AI is really acting, think of it as like a coordinator agent or a delegator agent. It's just understanding the intent and then matching that intent to the best smart agent that can do it. Right. And so there's a huge marketplace, right? Just like the App Store, there's thousands of apps. And think about this as matching it to that best application, right? So Morpheus is sort of at this protocol layer, and you can think of all these smart agents at the application layer, right? That are more narrow. They're tailored towards some use case. Like, hey, I want to swap my ETH. That's a swap agent. Oh, I want to stake my ETH. There's a staking agent. Oh, I just want to make an image. Great. There's smart agents that are tuned to making beautiful images, right? And so you're going to end up with this Cambrian explosion of smart agents, that anything people can imagine. And this gives them a place to publish them, to get paid for them, right? It handles all of the payment rails, it handles all of the different aspects. And so that's really the key here, is to make it easy for people to have one place where they can interact with their personal AI and connect to this giant cloud of new smart agents that are getting released.
The American public in particular has seemed to have a high degree of acceptance of centralized control over their data and their information. You would expect that people would not be trusting their lives and information and security with centralized entities. Yet there hasn't been a lot of evidence of this being eroded much.
So So I think a
How
lot of that, I think a lot of that is a artifact of the early days of the internet, where there wasn't an internet native payment rail. And so effectively the only way to monetize the early internet was attention, was advertisement, right? And so unsurprisingly, in the absence of a secure payment rail, Google all became about showing you ads, right? And Facebook became all about showing you ads. It's not that people were unwilling to pay. People subscribe to these days all sorts of things online. But they didn't train that behavior early on for search engines or social media or anything of that sort. So people became the product, right? Their attention, their time, their interest, their ability to be persuaded by advertisement became the default for how everything was paid, right? And it's convenient and it doesn't require sort of a lot of action from the user. And so, I think most other cases, people live in a world in which they want to own their photos, own their data, own a personal phone, for the same reasons you don't still call an operator and say, hey, give me Bob. Like, I just got him saved in my contacts, right? Um, and so I think people want that control. It really just wasn't an option in the early days, right? So I think that's sort of the first premise, is I think that's largely an artifact. The second thing is they can't compete. Think about the centralized AIs today. They can't take an action for you. They can give you information. They can give you a list of recommendations. They can tell you about best practices, but they have no ability to take an economic action, right? They're still stuck in Web 1, Web 2, where they don't have a payment rail, right? And so smart agents that are native to Web 3 are the only AIs that will be able to take an economic action on your behalf. And that's going to be the big differentiator. Like, AI without economic action is a toy. It can give me information, but it can't do anything on my behalf, right? How neutered, how restricted, how limited is that compared to an AI that can take an economic action, that can do a transaction, that can pay for something, that can, really get something done, not just tell me how to do it, right? The difference is night and day. And so because in 2024, Google still doesn't have a web wallet, right? How embarrassing is that? It's 2024 and they still can't touch smart contracts, send cryptocurrencies because they're a centralized company. That would make them a financial intermediary. They would need money transmission licenses. They would have to add KYC. The very nature of their structure limits them extremely in these use cases. Whereas the structure of a decentralized protocol that has no custody and never controls a user's funds, right, and doesn't act as a middleman, doesn't have all those restrictions, right, and can freely build software so users can use it directly for themselves, right? And that's, I think, the difference that we're seeing and is likely to lead in this next sort of explosion of growth in the industry is now all of a sudden we're taking all these superpowers, combining them and doing something the big tech giants simply can't do.
What's a good example of a use case that is compelling that could spark mass adoption on the use of money, since it's not something that people are used to being able to do?
It's hard to predict, right? But honestly, I think the low-hanging fruit is just sending crypto, just sending stable coins. If you look at a survey of most of the transactions in Web3, it's send Ethereum. It's been done 2 billion times. Send Bitcoin. It's been done 1 billion times. Send stable coins, hundreds of millions of transactions. And if you look at the other use cases, they're a lot smaller by comparison. They tend to get the attention, like DeFi or staking or things like that. But really, it's just lowering the barrier for people to simply safely send money, do transactions. Think about, for example, the ability to subscribe to something. You haven't been able to do that in Web3 because it's a push mechanism, right? I have to send transactions. It's not like putting my credit card on file and they pull a transaction every month. And this has been one of the breakthroughs with Morpheus is taking staked ETH and just using the yield as a payment mechanism, as a way to contribute automatically to something. That's going to open up all the world's software as a service and all the type of recurring payments today. They're done on Web2 for Web3 audience. So that's really, I think, the low-hanging fruit is just unlocking those basic actions for people and removing the technical barriers, right? And then you go from a few 100 million people that are savvy enough to do that to billions of people that are savvy enough to do that. I saw a survey last year of Facebook users, and I guess they have 3 or 4 billion users these days, and half of them, 50%, were unaware that Facebook used the internet to provide their service. Like, what does it have to do with the internet? It's just a button on my phone and the photo pops up, right? They have no concept it's connected to HTTP or should they need to, right? That's how winning looks, is you don't have to teach billions of people about how complex internet software works. It just works, right? That's when it becomes that magical experience.
I think this is really touches on a key. I had Alex Gladstein on as a guest, as well as Jared Rubin. Both of them, I've spent most of their time working on the bottom half of the world's population, those who don't have access to any financial institutions. And this is why structurally it's so hard for most Americans to bother understanding about this because it's just not necessary. Most of our daily needs on the payment side and handling money are just fine. And it's the folks that don't have access to all that where it's not fine at all. And so, that's one of the keys I think you just touched on.
Sure. Well, and if you look at the statistics, that's what it bears out. Where's the highest adoption rate in the world for crypto? Nigeria,
Nigeria,
Turkey,
Turkey,
Argentina,
Venezuela.
Vietnam, Indonesia, and Venezuela is almost too extreme where it's so broken, you can't almost help at all because, it's, basically robbery and theft and violence at this point. But anywhere where there's a functioning economy, but a high enough level of inflation on an annual basis that they're highly motivated to find an alternative. And so I think in Nigeria, it hit 50% adoption recently, which is huge, right? Because they're effectively skipping the banking rails, the way they skipped landlines. They went straight to cell phones. They're skipping banking and going straight to crypto. And it's like everybody there uses stable coins or Bitcoin or Ethereum in order to do daily business. And for them, it's a matter of life and death, right? They really care because if you lived in a place with 50 to 100% annual inflation, you'd really care too, right? And yeah, that's where it's going to go. And that's similar to what we saw with WhatsApp. Most of the adoption was international, long before anybody in the US had really cared about WhatsApp. Having free text messages, right, was a breakthrough for all those people that couldn't afford data. To have free text messages over Wi-Fi was a killer app that attracted billions of users, right? And eventually it came back to the US. So I think we're going to see something very similar here.
You spent a lot of time in Web3, and I'd love to talk about that just because that was also a critical underpinning of this new ability, the capabilities that lie ahead and that are now available. Talk about how that all evolved and what drew you there, and the whole concept of Web3 and ownership society, I guess, is another way of talking about it.
Sure. Well, it sort of naturally grew out of the early days of Bitcoin and then the early days of Ethereum, sort of this wider idea that this is really a reinvention of the web, right? Um, Not only does it give you a payment rail, it gives you an identity credential for every person with that public key, right? And so it was sort of filling in the missing gaps that you saw. But the best definition I've seen for Web 1 is you could find information, right? It was the informational web. I can use a search engine. Now I can discover all the world's websites, right? So you could read anything on the internet. That was Web 1. Web 2 was I could write to the internet, right? I could pop onto Facebook and post anything I wanted. I could go onto Twitter. I could broadcast to the world. The cost of writing and publishing fell to effectively zero, right? So I went from reading all the world's information, and in Web 2, I could write information. And in Web3, it's really the ability to own things on the internet, whether it's currency or stable coins or other assets. I finally had an ownership layer for the internet, right? And it was a combination of that payment rail and that identity credential and having a wallet, and it all sort of came together. And so we can reinvent all of the services today on the internet in this Web3 context. And that's what's happening, right? Is people are reinventing those old business models that presumed no ability to do payments with something where you have payments and currency and ownership, and people can own their own identity, right? They don't have to log in with Google or something else. They come with their own credentials. You can really build a much richer web experience with that context. And so that's sort of the history of where it came from.
And the potential of that is interesting because one of the, I asked earlier, what is the killer use case? And you said, well, it's really transmitting money from person to person. The key there is that the merchants need to be able to accept it. So
Right.
far, there hasn't been a need for that to happen. Once that does begin to happen, then all of a sudden it's a very interesting world of financial transactions because
Well,
you get to a tipping point at some point, and all of a sudden the global revenue and GDP that pays the economic rent for the financial system to function, that payment for the trust between the two parties, where you're getting a bank involved or you're getting some other financial intermediary involved, when that doesn't need to be there anymore, you can get a tipping point and a very interesting development in global economy, which is part
sure.
of why I think that the dangers of our fiscal deficit, structural deficits, and total debt may not be as threatening.
Great question. But I do want to push back a little bit and say that while merchant adoption in, sort of real world applications hasn't materialized, digital adoption has, right? So for Stripe or tons of other payment processors. They've all integrated, especially stable coins, right? The use of USDC and USDT has been very prolific. And if you look at the volumes, you're talking 50 to $100 billion a day, right? That's 10, 20 trillion dollars a year. You're getting to Visa level volumes, and most of that is happening on stablecoins, right? People are using Bitcoin as that digital gold, right? And Ethereum, I would say, is probably closest to the definition of money, and that it's the unit of account for so many of these smart contracts and other things. But stablecoins, right, have remained very popular, especially for international payments and remittances and stuff like that.
It's an excellent point, and you're right. I skimmed over it. I'm aware of all that. I was taking the view of stores that the economy that my peers are aware of is payments on the computer through my Visa card, rather than the knowledge of how much of the economy is now moving using stablecoins. And again, I think
Sure.
we're talking about a disproportionately large portion of that from overseas, where the dollar is a necessary and stable currency to be using and spending. And most other currencies, including cryptocurrencies, are not so available and so well used. They're available, but
Yeah,
they're not as well used. And there's a
sure.
familiarity of going into a digital dollar. We mentioned Nigeria earlier. I had Nick Anthony from the Cato Institute on about CBDCs and how Nigeria is doing everything they can to force use of CBDC. And here we have half the population using Bitcoin, and I don't think they got to 6% in Nigeria, and that was because they removed cash. So
Yep.
it's hopefully it'll be an uphill battle for most
Sure.
countries trying to introduce CBDCs, because I do think that what people don't really understand is that stablecoins provides the technology, the same technology that a CBDC would be able to do, and
Sure.
already has.
Minus the inflation and
Right.
government control. Yes.
And the centralized
Well,
control.
and just to go back to your question about killer use cases, I think the other one is very simple. It's yield, right? Why do people put money in a bank account? Well, they used to lend those dollars out and give you 5% a year or whatever. And we're seeing that effectively being re-implemented, with staking rewards on Ethereum. You earn about 3% a year, right? Ethereum on Ethereum. And that's created this huge demand. There's, $100 billion plus of staked ETH now, right? And what do people want? They want yield. If they're going to hold a currency, right? They don't want to be diluted or inflated. They actually want to earn more of it over time, right? And so these staking mechanisms, especially directly from the protocols, create a very stable sort of risk-free rate. If you think about it in those kind of terms, almost like U.S. Treasury does for dollars, right? It's an obligation directly from the group that's printing the dollars, and the Ethereum staking is a reward directly from the protocol that's emitting the tokens, right? And so that's been a killer use case for Morpheus. It's only possible because people can deposit their staked ETH, they can contribute just the yield and always withdraw their principal, right? You're creating a way, almost like a 0% coupon, right, to donate that yield every day to a project that you want to support, right? It gives more people a reason to stake their ETH.
Yeah. That cash flow, you can look at that Ethereum yield as a cash flow as well. And Matthew Siegel from Van Eck used to do valuation of Ethereum based on its cash flow. And he compared it to software companies and showed how dramatically inexpensive Ethereum was as an investment compared to based on cash flow to the major software companies. Fascinating angle to think about. It feels like once Morpheus, I don't know how well known it is right now. And as you were pointing out, it's hard to imagine how centralized entities will be able to compete for many reasons. One, they don't have access to money, but and it feels like once this actually catches hold, one of the things you were talking about is now that you have a user interface that is easy. The move from hundreds of millions of users to billions of users shouldn't be very far away. And you kind of get to a tipping point in adoption and network effect that would be very compelling. And it gets me thinking about the cycles in technology that swing from centralization to decentralization and back to decentralization and decentralization. Is this it feels like this could be a very large one that would be very difficult to centralize.
Yeah, I mean, so many of the centralized systems, presume ownership and control of, the user experience, right? And to have the user no longer need an intermediary to have that experience, just to have the own personal agent, right? That can answer their questions, that can guide them, that can take actions on their behalf, right? I mean, that's a game changer. A lot of the decentralization has been on the back end, right? It's been on the protocol level, it's been for developers, but not for retail, not for the average user. And so this is the first time we're having the opportunity, right, to extend all of this infrastructure to the front end and the interface and really open it up to everybody.
Out of curiosity, what does it cost a user to access the Morpheus AI?
Nothing. You can download the full node for free, run it on your own laptop, and create text from, a Llama 3 model or anything else you want. And so it's like asking what's the cost of Linux? It's all open source. You can download a copy of Linux and install it on your own computer. The reason for a network, though, is there's some use cases where you need more powerful hardware and you might not have a GPU and you really want to make an image. Okay, well, here's a network. If you own some of the Morpheus tokens, you can stake them and access all those GPUs, right? It's giving you access to that cloud of infrastructure. And that's how all crypto works, right? You have to have a way for the protocol, for the software to pay for its own hardware. And that's what the Morpheus token does, just as it does in Bitcoin, Ethereum, or any other decentralized protocol, is it gives you access to other people's hardware and creates an incentive for those other people to provide that hardware. So you can use the local version for nothing. You can run it yourself. If you have a GPU, you can run it and provide it to others. The compute router is in testnet right now and looks like it'll go live on a mainnet in just a few weeks. So the capital aspects have been live since February. It's rewarding people for providing code. The compute aspects go live, that'll reward people for the GPUs. And finally, the builders, people making those agents or interfaces or websites get rewarded too. And so I really love that the rewards are spread over not just capital and not just over compute, but over the builders and coders. I really haven't seen a protocol since the early days of Ethereum that took so seriously the idea of rewarding the builders. Usually that gets centralized into a foundation and there's a bunch of committees or DAOs and votes, but here it's become entirely decentralized to provide code, to build things on Morpheus. And I think that's really the key for broad adoption.
How has the amount of staked ETH changed over time?
Well, for Ethereum in general, it continues to grow. For Morpheus, we saw an initial huge spike of staked
Amazing.
Ethereum. You're talking hundreds of millions of
Yeah.
dollars. And there's no company, there's no foundation, there's no PR, there's no marketing. It was literally just word of mouth, people jumping on podcasts like this or AMAs and you just talking about why it was so important. And so that's been great to see. I think right now it's around like 72,000 staked Ethereum in the protocol. And every day that's generating more yield and that gets contributed to the protocol and liquidity. And that's really important to understand. The yield's not being sent to anybody. There's no treasury. There's nobody with a wallet holding those rewards. It goes directly into the protocol and liquidity, which means that it buys tokens out of Uniswap. It burns some of the tokens. It holds some of them, right, for liquidity and in those trading pairs, right? So it's sort of benefiting everybody equally. And I think that's so much more efficient than creating a bureaucracy and you end up with a bunch of politics and everybody's lobbying for how funds should be spent. Instead, just make it automatic. Just Just have all the yield go into liquidity, and anybody who wants to sell their tokens can sell their tokens. If they earned them for code or compute or building, doesn't matter, right? Everybody gets treated the same. And I think that's really revolutionary. This idea of a fair launch where there's no pre-mine, there's no company. It's all been built into the smart contracts directly.
What you mentioned Venice earlier. What are
Mhm.
the differences between Morpheus, do I call it the Morpheus system or the Morpheus project and
Sure.
Venice?
Well, Venice is an example of somebody building on the Morpheus ecosystem, right? Using it for compute. Other people have launched projects on Morpheus using it for capital, right? The same smart contracts that Morpheus used for its fair launch, others are using for their fair launch, right? I think over $1 billion now has gone through the same smart contracts that Morpheus used for other projects, right? And they're all part of the same community and part of the yield flows back to the Morpheus protocol and liquidity. So it supports the development of more smart contracts and more audits and more, safety is being developed. Honestly, I'm surprised nobody had sort of created a common set of contracts that anybody could use. Everybody was still making their own bespoke smart contracts and getting them audited versus using, a set of what are called factory contracts that are all the same, and you could just push a button and it pops out a smart contract for your project, based on the name of your project and, the type of groups that you want to reward are different for each one.
What I'm thinking about is the 5 years from now, and the users have gone shooting past 1 billion, and everything is working. The value of everything should be going up because this can be such an empowering technological development for individual people. And so
Mhm.
the global value, the economic value should be rising. How does it look like? Where is it showing up, and how does it unfold, do you think?
I think you'll just look at the market cap on CoinGecko and it will show tens of trillions of dollars instead of $2 trillion, right? There's almost a one-to-one correlation. It's like a 94% correlation of the number of crypto users to the value of the protocols, which makes sense because each one that's using it is adding, their value to the network, right? And so that's, I think the key insight here is I view this as changing the world's accounting system, changing its property rights system. That doesn't happen very often, right? We're moving from the old ledger system to a new ledger. And today, $2 trillion of value is moved onto the new ledger. Over time, I think most of the economic activity, even of centralized entities, will move on to this ledger. You look at E&Y, Ernst and Young, and they've built a second layer on Ethereum for accounting purposes and smart contract purposes. And they're one of the first movers kind of building this new ledger because it turns out automating audits is really useful, right? This transparency of the ledger, all of the other tools, right, are maturing, and you're getting privacy now. They've built a privacy first one using zero knowledge proofs. So they're not exposing that data to the world. They're still keeping the privacy of their clients and enterprises. So I think it's a world in which both exist. I actually don't think that Microsoft or others will necessarily decline. It's a question of what percentage of the future usage will be on these decentralized systems versus not, right? And I expect an outcome similar to Linux, similar to Android, right?
Where
96% of all servers now are using Linux, right? And something like 80 or 90% of all phones are Android, which is what you'd expect. The open source version doesn't cost any license fee, doesn't insert the friction. You don't need permission. It doesn't have to be available in your country. All those barriers go away. And so I'm not predicting that those old systems will go away. With the separation of church and state, there's still a Catholic church, here 500 years later, but, you can opt into it or you can opt out of it. And that's the key, is having that alternative with the separation of money and state where you can opt into it or you can opt out of it.
And I was thinking that the choice would be so stark that the advantages of opting out would be so stark that the the market share of the privately owned centralized entities would be declining, even if they were taking advantage of the benefits of blockchain technology and being able to move money around. They, like the financial system, is likely to be losing on the margin because they do, users don't need to pay that economic rent anymore for trust.
I'll say this, they'll adapt or they'll die.
Yeah.
Like, and that's is true of all companies, right? If you look at
Amen.
the
Yep.
Fortune 100 over the last 100 years, it's radically changed. We still call it the Fortune 100, but almost all the companies have switched, right? And so I think it'll be very similar. The
And
companies that know how to make the switch, and to give credit where credit's due, who's pushing the hardest in this direction? It's Elon. He open sourced Grok. He's getting money transmission licenses for X, so it's going to be able to act. It'll probably be the first major tech company that has a wallet. And he loves Dogecoin. Okay, great. You can send Dogecoin, but that's
or
just a
not.
foot in the yeah, and that's just a foot in the door. Once you've got a wallet in the hands of 500 million people with an X account, that'll double the number of Web3 wallets in the world, right? Overnight. And so, as per usual, like he sees the writing on the wall and he's moving in that direction, and he's sort of future proofing his efforts with AI. I think he sees decentralized AI as the future, and so he's open sourcing the technology. I love to see even more of that. It's great to see that he's announcing the move of the headquarters of Twitter to Austin, right? California is competing
Your
with
hometown,
Iowa,
yeah, your
right?
hometown.
It's and so these systems, people tend to think of these systems as monolithic, but they're not. They all exist in this competitive marketplace of the world. And if you don't compete over a long enough time, you're going to lose market share. You're going to lose proportion. California lost 10% of their population, right? It's like those people want to go somewhere else. That's what happened to Detroit. I meet young people, they've never heard of Detroit. They don't know the Motor City. They don't know it used to be a wealthy city and a million people. They know it for poverty and where Eminem came from. Like that's now, if you have those bad policies for long enough, that's the fate that you suffer, right? And so, but anybody that wants to come onto the side of open source and growth and permissionless building, then you're free to do so. And the sooner that you do, the more benefit you see. I have a friend who often says people buy crypto at the price they deserve.
Yeah.
And if you're willing to invest just a little time understanding these systems, using them, trying them, experimenting with them, the benefits are enormous because you become that expert in your friend group that understands what's happening in this trend. You can see, the obvious growth trend. And you get to benefit your family and friends. And so it's certainly worth that investment.
Yeah, I think the one of the issues has always been that Ethereum is not quite as efficient as centralized computer systems can be, but it's much more powerful over the long run. How do the efficiencies get worked out over time on protocols?
So I guess the real question is efficient at what? Right. So there's a technically correct yes if you ran it in one server versus many servers. In the case of Bitcoin or Ethereum, it would be more efficient. But a wire takes 2 or 3 days, and this one over here will clear in 10 minutes in the case of Bitcoin, or 12 seconds in the case of Ethereum. By judging efficiency of like the actual outcome, well, it's a lot more efficient. Like, I don't care how many servers it took in the back end to run all the checks. Like, the user doesn't care about that. And they paid 5 cents instead of $25 for the wire versus the 5 cents for sending the money. It's more cost efficient. So it's more time and cost efficient, but there's more servers running in the background. That seems like a very academic, like, I don't care how many servers are running in the background of Visa, whether it's 10 or 10,000, doesn't matter to me, right? This new efficient system, the efficiency that the user actually cares about is cost and time, right? And so, when it comes to AI, it's the same thing. And that's probably a good misconception or misnomer to go ahead and get rid of, is just because you're using decentralized AI doesn't mean it's running over multiple machines. Think of much more like a marketplace where you can pick any provider you want. You don't have to use OpenAI or Microsoft. There's 1,000 people running the GPUs, but it's not necessarily splitting the jobs 1,000 ways. It's going to one GPU. They're running the job and giving you an output. If you like the performance, you can stick with them, or you can switch to any other GPU, right? And so you're not suffering any efficiency loss. It's not like blockchain where it's trying to provide consensus over thousands of different servers that are all keeping a similar record. In this case, it's one bespoke request for this image or this text, whatever you want. And so it's helpful to understand, yes, the system itself is decentralized. And I think that's why, Venice uses more the language of permissionless or uncensored, because decentralized means a lot of things to a lot of people. What do you really care about is the output. Is it private? Is it permissionless? Is it, uncensored? Am I getting raw, true, accurate machine intelligence, as opposed to what I've been getting from Microsoft or somebody else?
Really clarifying, and it is that permissionless trust that is a key. It really is the key. It does just feel like we are beholden to, especially over the last 5 years, as the Twitter files came out and everything, that the risks of centralization have hit the headlines, and it hasn't been personal to enough people to raise an alarm in society. But at some point we may get a tipping point like that, and it seems that this is the direction of returning control to individuals that often, or throughout history, seems to be a cornerstone of the feeling of prosperity, of control. Do you think about it in those terms?
I think access to intelligence is the single most important thing the next few decades. Like, your access to intelligence will be whether you can become 10 times, eventually 100 or 1,000 times more efficient. Economic actors that aren't connected to intelligence aren't going to be relevant, right? Like, the Amish still exist, they're just not economically relevant, right? And so that's the inflection point we're at. We're at this incredible moment in history where you really want a personal AI that's open source and that's permissionless and that lets you access intelligence at scale. And if we lose that, like, we're not coming back from that, right? So at least not in this jurisdiction, right? So, the need and the urgency, I think, is there. People are understanding how important that is and how important that's going to be in the coming years as artificial intelligence, is going to scale with the compute, and it's going to be 1,000 times more powerful in the coming years. You want that working for you, not against you, right? And so the safety, the safety aspect, the thing to worry about is centralization.
That's right. You don't want to surrender that to some other entity that has control over it.
Well, and you want good actors to be provisioned with the best technology. And if you try to restrict the technology, the only people accessing it will be the bad actors, right? And so by definition, you would be creating the outcome you're trying to avoid if you did that. And so we're only a few days away, 8 days away from when the Commerce Department will give their rules on whether open source weights in the US will be legal or whether they'll be illegal. The EU has already made their statements, and their restrictions go into place on August 1st. China obviously has huge restrictions on AI. And so we're finding out right now where the friendly place is going to be. So far, it looks like the UK won't regulate. Singapore is going to remain a free jurisdiction. Dubai, probably Switzerland, a few others. So the world is bifurcating. Where are these systems going to be built? Where are they going to be hosted? But regardless of where they're built, just like Bitcoin or Ethereum, it doesn't matter where the nodes are run as long as people can access it, right? And so that's the evolution that we're going through right now. Is, I think people are starting to appreciate, but I don't think they've appreciated how important this subject is and how critical and timely it is to get access to it in a way that's permissionless. So I'm so happy that the Morpheus community has grown so quickly. It went from a white paper to smart contracts in only a few months to hundreds of millions of dollars of support to now real GPUs and real smart agents taking actions on behalf of users. Like that's incredible. And so,
And developers
you know,
working like crazy.
yeah, every day, literally every day, there's something shipped. That's, this new test net, this new smart contract, this improvement. When you don't have any friction, people can just build. They didn't have to ask anybody's permission. Like Venice, Eric Voorhees, he didn't ask anybody's permission to build this thing. He just did it, right? And that's how it should be,
Yep.
right? And so it's an exciting time.
It's fantastic. David, thank you so much for joining me today. Really, really
Absolutely.
interesting stuff.
Great to be here,
Hopeful
Bob.
and encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Take care.
You too.
Thanks.
Bye.